Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock take time to talk about contemporary ideas in theology and philosophy, specifically Zygmunt Bauman's idea of liquid modernity.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, as you were talking, you had mentioned once before, I think, in our discussions book, and it struck me as you were talking about it that I recall, never read it, but I recall being in a group of folk who decided they wanted to read a book about the church called Liquid Church. Interestingly, I went and looked it up. It's called Liquid Church: 6 Powerful Currents to Saturate Your City for Christ. It's a 2019 book by Tim Lucas, and there's a foreword by Carey Nieuwhof, who I heard of. He's been in some discussions about where the church should go. Now, and because I hadn't read the book, I don't know whether there is a tie between this concept from Zygmunt Bauman of liquid modernity with liquid church. And as you were talking, I just did a real quick look, and it does appear that there is at least an article in the International Journal for the Study of the Church by a Kees de Groot called "The Church in Liquid Modernity: A Sociological and Theological Exploration of a Liquid Church." Now, most of his discussion does not appear to totally focus on that book, but it appears from what little I have access to it that there has been some discussion. But then he says his message diverges from that of Zygmunt Bauman, even though it's supposed to support it. Ward suggests fluid structures are helpful in marketing the gospel. I argue that this approach takes the sting out of Bauman's social theory. Now, I'm not quite all sure what that means, but I found it then interesting as I was looking at that, and you're talking a little bit then about this idea of where do we put our feet? And if you're going to take a dialectic step in order to have this dialogue with these other ideas, where do you put the foot? Where do you step? And it does seem like that perhaps these folks talking about liquid church are less talking about a dialectic step toward a completely different way of even thinking about who God is, and that they're really more just talking about structures of church, right? That maybe the old structures of denominations and those kinds of things, parachurch organizations, maybe should become a little less solid, a little more liquid, and we are actually seeing a little bit of that happen. But it is a really interesting concept, and I'm interested in learning from you a little bit more about where Bauman would take this idea, because again, I generally would say, yeah, you're concerned that when we step off in a particular direction to meet with, if we're going to dialogue with somebody who's coming from a different direction and we step in their direction to discuss with them, it doesn't work real well if we don't even know where they're coming from, if we don't know if there's any solid ground there, or we don't even know, sounds like with his concept of liquid modernity, we're not even certain where these other voices to dialogue with are even at. And that makes it awful hard to deal with. So I'm interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and especially the Carey Nieuwhof reference, because that is the qualification where I was hoping to not go. So in other words, I think Nieuwhof is part of the New City, I think the Keller circles, that church leadership in the modern woke era. And so that is the one precise area I don't want to go. But it's important to distinguish, because you could see how a critic could think that's where this idea of liquidity in Christianity might be destined for. And that's the one direction that I wanted to really be clear about and say, whatever it is I'm talking about, it's not that. It's not taking Bauman's thesis and mapping it onto Christianity, this dialectic step, as it were. However, it's pretty important and crucial to say more than just it's not that. And I want to do that. But before I get there, I have to read a little bit more of Bauman, see where Bauman's going to eventually end up, and why I would say Christianity could not go in Bauman's particular direction. So let me start with that, and let me start with a little bit more of Bauman from his foreword. So Bauman says this: we feel rather than know. We remain, of course, as modern as we were before, but the we who are modern have considerably grown in numbers in recent years. We may well say that by now all, or almost all of us in every or almost every part of the planet have become modern. And that means that today, unlike a decade or two ago, every land on the planet, with only a few exceptions, is subject to the obsessive, compulsive, unstoppable change that is nowadays called modernization. And I'm going to insert a word that's not there, but I think is going to help clarify where I expect is this is a secular modernization. I think one of the stories that we're going to hear, the narratives that we're going to hear from this modernizing crowd is that modernization is inherently secular, that Christianity has no role to play and can play no role, for it is limited by its immutable aspects and its doctrine. And that's where I'm going to disagree with a Christian modernity in the form and shape of Bauman's thesis. But let me get back to the text. So Bauman says, every land on the planet is subject to this unstoppable change that is nowadays called secular modernization. And everything that goes with it, including the continuous production of human redundancy and the social tension it is bound to cause. What unites all forms of modern life is their fragility, their temporary, their vulnerability and inclination, constant change. To be modern means to modernize compulsively, obsessively, not so much just be, let alone keep its identity intact, but forever becoming, avoiding completion, staying underdefined. Now that forever becoming, that could be right out of a pantheistic worldview. And that's one of the reasons why I would absolutely oppose a Christian modernity in Bauman's sense, because I suspect it would largely be a Christian pantheism, and we probably already have Christian pantheists who've tried to go down this path. Now, Bauman continued, each new structure which replaces the previous one is only another momentary settlement, acknowledged as temporary, and until further notice. What I've chosen to call liquid modernity is the growing conviction that change is the only permanent and uncertainty the only certainty. To be modern 100 years ago meant chasing a final state of perfection. Now it means an infinity of improvement with no final state in sight and none desired. So the liquidness of this secularly modern conceptual framework, I think it would be fair to say that follows upon schools of thought in the past that have said things like value and meaning is defined by the value and meaning that humans give to a thing. So Protagoras' famous quote about humanism, man is the measure of all things. That's it. Man is the measure of all things. And that whatever social mores and values are, whatever doctrines or concepts exist, are ultimately self-generated. And this is the essence of phenomenalism. This is the essence of the Hegelian dialectic. This is the essence of the pantheistic approaches to always becoming. Being becomes just becoming or merely becoming. And now, does Bauman embrace all of that? He embraces enough of it that I would not ever want to syncritically wed pantheism with Christianity. Having said that, there's a really important secondary theme going on here that I want to get to, and that is Christianity has never been quite the changeless thing its critics have painted it to be. Now, I know that's going to require clarification. So before somebody listens to us and thinks, oh no, Brock's just thrown out the fundamental unchanging doctrines of the faith in saying this, I haven't done that. And I want to talk about the reason why I haven't done that. But I wanted to just stop and give you a chance to maybe ruminate or reflect about this, Bauman's main thesis, this liquid modernity. Change is the only permanence. There is no end state. There is only an infinity of improvement. And there is no desire to move toward any particular ideal. It's liquid. So let me throw that over to you, Chuck, before I try to clarify.
And that is really interesting. And I'm thinking about how that might play out, because I do have a sense in which that idea in certain contexts, I can see why some people can express that. Perhaps not so much as a desire, but as a description, not so much as a prescription, but as a there is a sense in which change always happens. There is, just even in the very Western concept of time, that is linear rather than circular, like in some Eastern conceptions. There is a sense in which there's always change. And whether or not there's a direction, there's at least an inability of us to fully understand where that direction is going. And so we feel that it is in some ways directionless. So I can see that somewhat, but I can also see why many might have some concerns with that as well. Because if there is never a goal in mind, even temporarily, then why do we do anything that we do other than just for the moment, other than just feels good right now, so I'm going to do it. And it does seem to me that there is a little bit that way of thinking really did, perhaps in the last 50 to 60 years, really did have a strong appeal to people. And I do get the sense that in some ways we may be, as a culture, moving away from that, moving away from just if it feels good in the moment, do it, and more of a concern about we need to plan, think more down to the future. However, that said, there is also, I think, a lot of disagreement on then if it almost seems like what's happened maybe is that we went from perhaps an idea of we all agreed on what the end should be, whether it's the Depression era, and we may have had differences between political parties in the U.S. about exactly how to get to prosperity, but there was this goal of prosperity, right? This goal of economic growth. And in World War II, we may not have agreed exactly on how to get there, but there was this goal of ending dictatorship and bringing democracy to Europe and the rest of the world. And then we hit I think we sometimes turn the 1960s into a big bugaboo, but there is some truth to the fact that things started changing in the 60s, and there was this sense in which not everyone, but there was a lot of thought of, hey, in the end, just live your life, just do what you feel like, just do what feels best, because what else is there in life? And now maybe moving away from that, recognizing that's not necessarily the way to live. It's not going to be beneficial for our society. It's not going to be beneficial for the earth. But now that we are trying to come back to a direction, having lost that direction, we now have a multiplicity of different directions that people may want to go that are very different from the ones that we had previous. There is a sense in which that some of the political strife that we're dealing with is a lot about what is that direction that we all ought to agree on. Now, I think that takes it a little bit away from your context, and I am really interested in hearing, but it is an interesting way to think about it. So, yeah, I'd like to hear more. I'd like to hear more from you.
Okay, so before maybe making the main point, let me just start with some context about the Confessional Church in America. I think it's roughly reflective of the Confessional Church in Western society. And of course, it may not be in certain situations. But I would say two of the biggest issues that have become painfully apparent since the rise of creedal confessionalism, and I'm thinking here of the high period of the Protestant post-Reformation Orthodoxy period, so roughly the 100 years that would roughly correspond to the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm thinking of the time of the Great Creeds. I'm thinking of Dort, Westminster Confession, the Augsburg Confession, the Three Forms of Unity, 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, many more, lots of good ones. I don't mean to denigrate ones that are omitted. They almost served as what we might contemporarily today call as an SLA for Christianity. So when you sign a contract with a service provider, you sign this agreement, maybe it's 3 to 5 pages of legal writing, and it spells out in legalese some important terms and conditions that will allow both the vendor and the customer to have a happy coexistence with each other, theoretically. And I think that's the best of confessionalism. The best of confessionalism brought together important doctrinal truths in summary forms, in catechizing forms, in question and answer forms that were great for apologetics. But we find that and I wouldn't say this is an improvement, we find that complex SLAs are often obstacles today. And I'm not saying this as an improvement. Many people think that can be an improvement, and I'm not for complex SLAs per se, but I want to say that counterparty risk in interactions in the culture has perhaps never been higher. And this might be an arguable point. What do I mean by that? This idea that you and I can engage in business with just average other citizens and have some profitable protection. I have grain and you have gold coins, and you have too many gold coins and I have too much grain, and so we exchange for the better. Or I have grain and you have a strong back, or labor or services, however we want to word this. I've not seen counterparty risk so great in my lifetime. In other words, the risk that you can go out and do an honest day's work or hand over an honest dollar and be, what's the right word here, be taken advantage of, be cheated, has never been perhaps more exposed or more obvious. Now, I don't want to make it sound like this is a brand new thing for our age, but I think the visibility of it is really great. And so in light of this, the confessional standards have faced attacks on two sides from I would consider to be faithless participants in an interaction. And that maybe is the right way of understanding this counterparty risk, a loss of good faith in doing business, in interacting with each other socially. And so confessionalism and these creedal statements, these SLAs, use a contemporary form, have faced pressure from the inside and from the outside. So from the inside, confessional churches have been under attack for hundreds of years by what could be called an aggressive hyper-confessionalism. And Chuck, you come to my church and we want to break bread together and fellowship and enter into arrangements. And we're talking about ways to do that. And we're talking about our shared love of the Lord. And I just happened to mention a certain doctrinal point that you're not quite in agreement with me. It's obviously a secondary issue, but we're not quite in agreement. And I just maybe I pull something on you and say, if you don't agree with me on the secondary point, we can't fellowship. We can't do business. In fact, I think you might not even be a Christian, or you might not be Reformed, or you might not be wherever I want to draw the line. And it turns into this ugly, aggressive partisanship where I am the Reformed police and I police you so as to achieve a more favorable position in the relationship. And so that's an internal pressure, and it's absolutely devastated the confessional church, in my view, in our lifetimes. And then on the outside, we have this liquidly modern crowd, people who want to rewrite the social norms and mores. And unlike Moses, who went up on high to receive God's commandments, these liquid secular moderns reject any external lawgiver, including the God who appeared to Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments. And so you have these internal pressures of hyper-confessionalism, and then you have these external pressures of this just utter rejection of specifically the Christian concept of God as moral lawgiver, but in general, any lawgiver that's external to the human self, acting as its own autonomous sovereign. So you have these pressures, and I would say the middle class of confessionalism in the West is really being wiped out by that. And I'm being here descriptive. I'm not speaking prescriptively. I'm just describing the landscape as I see that. And so in that sense, I really do think there's an interesting situational awareness that we Reformed people ought to have in this light. And I didn't answer the question. I didn't quite resolve all the differences there, but I wanted to at least lay out those factors before we proceeded further to see if, maybe you had seen the same thing, or maybe you're not seeing the same thing, or if so, descriptively where you saw those factors.